Electricity prices have emerged as one of the most important and relevant topics facing policymakers in the United States today. Consumers around the country are feeling the squeeze, and our ability to build an electricity system which will provide for AI data centers, reshoring of manufacturing, and happy ratepayers and voters is in question. So our conversation today is going to touch on these issues, help us get a better understanding of what drives electricity prices in the United States and what policymakers might be able to do about it. I'm joined by two experts that there's almost no one in the world I'd rather hear from than these two on questions of what actually drives electricity price increases in the United States, how much are they going up compared to our expectation, and what should we do about it. Allison Clements, former commissioner at FERC, now a partner at ASG and Principal at 804 Advisory. Allison, welcome to today's conversation.
Thanks, Joseph. It's great to be here.
And we're joined remotely, but fulsomely, by Ryan Hledik, principal at the Brattle Group, who's a lead researcher there. Ryan, maybe we can start with you. Brattle, in collaboration with LLBL, I believe, recently published a report on electricity pricing in the United States and drivers. What are the highlights that people should pay attention to?
Well, I think the first highlight, the thing that really jumped out at me when we started that research was just the general historical trend in electricity rates in the US over the past decade. I think there's a lot of attention being given right now to the fact that electricity rates are rising, and they are. But one of the interesting takeaways was once we adjusted that electricity rate trend for inflation, what we found is that electricity prices haven't actually been going up faster than other household goods.
But the point of comparison there, Ryan, is a little tricky because inflation over the past 5 years has been one of our biggest political challenges.
Yeah, I was just about to say that's not necessarily encouraging news to households, telling them that it's not getting more expensive than other stuff, but it was at least an interesting takeaway that this isn't, these prices aren't rising at a rate that's abnormal relative to the general inflationary trend that we've seen.
And, help us, just the viewer, a lot of people are coming to this for the first time. Allison, maybe we can go to you. How are electricity prices set in the United States, and what are the most important factors in the trends that we've seen recently?
Yeah, I think to put prices into context, maybe we go back 24, 36 months ago when data centers were not a household word. And we think about what goes into the price of electricity. There's two levels of price. There's the federally regulated piece and the state regulated piece. And within that comes the cost, in some variation, depending on where you are in the country, comes the cost of generating electricity and the fuel that goes into that, the cost of transporting those electrons across big wires and then stepping down to small wires, and of course the cost of transporting finally those electrons into your home. So there's a bunch of components that make up the cost of electricity.
So we have electricity is an infrastructure heavy kind of component of the economy, right? You've got large transmission projects, you've got the distribution system, the sort of wires that your average American would be familiar with, and then you've got the generation assets, which now is more diverse than ever. In the United States, the conversation around electricity costs often creates a proxy argument about climate policy, about what kind of generation should we favor. Ryan, what does your research tell us about where this debate is and where it should be?
Well, I think, the big driver of rate increases that we haven't been talking about very much is ongoing investment that's needed for the transmission and distribution system, poles and wires. The fact is there are significant portions of our transmission distribution system that are 80 years old at this point. And we're needing to go out and replace that equipment right at a time when it's gotten a lot more expensive due to ongoing supply chain constraints coming out of the pandemic. And that's a fairly unavoidable cost, but when we did our research, that was one of the most significant and widespread drivers of rate increases that we identified.
Tell me a little bit more about the supply constraints faced after the pandemic. Is that particular kinds of machinery? Is it labor? What's the driver here?
Yeah, what we looked at was the cost of equipment, transformers, different engineering technologies that are various components of the transmission and distribution system. In some cases, depending on which component you're looking at, it costs multiples more than it did prior to the pandemic.
Allison, what's your read on that situation, right? Why is it now suddenly expensive to buy a transformer than it wasn't necessarily 7 years ago?
Well, as Ryan just said, there's 80-year-old heavy infrastructure sitting around our country that needs to be updated. And I think one of the important things when you start off a conversation about electricity rates is to point out, which those of us who think about it all day kind of take for granted, is that unlike the cost of a bridge or other big infrastructure that the government might pay for from the general treasury, you and I, ratepayers, on our monthly electricity bills, pay for those grid investment, those poles and wires investments. And so the cost ultimately flows through to the utilities customers, and that's really important. So we have these massive, even before data centers came on the scene, we were at this massive inflection point where, the system had been humming along for 50 years. But as we came out of the pandemic and as electrification started to take hold across industries in the country, we then find ourselves in a situation where, wow, this grid, which hasn't been run particularly efficiently and is old, is increasingly unfit for purpose relative to these challenges we're facing. And so we have growth, we need supply chain, which because of the pandemic and for the reasons I just described, are getting more expensive and more in demand. And so here we are, where all of a sudden we need to meet all this new demand very quickly, but the things we've been talking about have been taking shape for decades and have to be dealt with.
How much is growth an important part of that story? So, we've now all heard for the past 2 decades, the electricity sector in the United States has grown very slowly, 1% a year or less than. Now we're faced with multiple percentage per year's growth driven by data centers and other sources, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Is this just like the industry catching up with reality? How should we think about that growth versus like ongoing maintenance and rebuilding of a system that had gotten clunky and old?
Well, I think that the load growth that we are looking at in forecasting over the next 1 to 3 to 5 years was pretty unexpected. Like Allison said, even 12 to 24 months ago, I think a lot of analysts were just not anticipating the level of growth in electricity demand that we're now seeing. So this is not just a slight deviation in the historical trend. This is a step change in terms of the level of growth that we need to deal with as an industry now.
Ryan, what does your research tell us about the nature of the system as it exists? So Allison points out, I think very importantly, that electricity rates pay for the infrastructure across the whole system, right? And regulators, which we're going to talk about in a minute as well, help figure out how to do that. But the system and the way consumers and residents interact with it is also changing, right? You've got electric vehicles, which are, I understand, way more demanding of local distribution power grids than any technology we've had before. Home electrification is increasing, as well as like electrification of commercial buildings. And then you've got like rooftop solar and home batteries and all this stuff. Is some of the signal we're seeing just the changing kind of infrastructure and reflecting the way that the power system is working now?
I don't think we've yet reached the level of electric vehicle adoption or residential behind the meter battery adoption that has become a major driver of changes in electricity rates.
Okay.
But I do think as we look ahead to the future, I imagine we'll get to this in a minute, but as we look ahead to the future, those technologies that you just described, those are technologies that are very flexible in terms of how they can consume energy and when. And so they do present a big opportunity for us as tools to manage the grid in a way that is potentially more cost effective and could help put downward pressure on rates.
And then Allison, I have a question for you about regions. So when you previously were a commissioner at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, overseeing the whole country's electricity infrastructure, there seem to me to be incredible disparities state by state in how electricity prices are changing. Largely, it seems fair to say, blue coastal states rising faster than red interior states. What are the most important drivers and disparities in how people in different states feel changing electricity prices?
Well, I'll let Ryan go state by state, but as my good friend Ralph Cavanna has always said, it's not about the rate you pay, it's about the price on the bill.
Right.
And so you look in California and you look at the wildfire risk, which
Right.
was for some time unique to California, as an example, right? If you take that wildfire risk out, which could have happened across any state, and you look at the bills that customers are paying in California, they're not higher as a percentage from an energy burden perspective than might be the case in other states with much lower rates.
Right.
And because they have invested a lot of money that comes through rates in energy efficiency and other ways of making the existing grid smarter in order to keep bills
So
ultimately down.
It is quite feasible that you have higher rates but less consumption through energy efficiency, accident of geography,
Right.
and so lower overall energy burden on households, for instance.
Sure, and I mean, I jumped into that, but if you
Right.
step back and you look at the resource mix, like you said, the geography, whether or not you're near a shale
Right.
basin, whether or not you had access historically to coal, whether or not it's windy and sunny, all of these factors play into the resource mix. I mean, the common thread across the country is that you need poles and wires to move all this stuff,
Right.
and that until recently you couldn't store it. And so that's where we are now trying to, I think, catch up, make better use of the existing system, use some of this technology that the grid is powering to help the grid.
But we also have different modes of governing the power sector, right? Like in some places you have liberalized, deregulated markets, and others you have still a high degree of vertical integration. Do you see that playing an important role?
Absolutely. I mean, I think across the country, whether or not you're in a vertically integrated utility region where the utility owns the transmission, the distribution, and the generation, or you're in a restructured state with a wholesale market overlay, in which case one company owns the poles and wires, and then there's competitive generation.
Right.
The costs for generating the electricity have actually gone down. But everywhere, the poles and wires are an issue.
Ryan, maybe we could hear your perspective on this. I mean, I've done my own research, my own charting, and we see that prices in both regulated and deregulated states have gone up. Deregulated states have gone up more. What does your research show us about the drivers of price increases geographically or around the United States?
Yeah, and it depends on, I think that dynamic that you just described, Joseph, it does depend on kind of the time horizon that you're considering. I think in the short run, in just the past 6 months, we have seen prices in deregulated parts of the country, like the PJM market, for example, having gone up due to accelerated load growth and demand significantly outpacing supply. That is generally how markets are supposed to work. When demand exceeds supply, prices go up, that attracts new supply, and then prices are eventually supposed to come back down. So I think, that is a dynamic that needs to be considered here. But, I think in terms of other drivers of regional variation in rate impacts, Allison mentioned natural disasters, both planning for natural disasters and then recovering from those. Huge driver of rates in California, as well as Gulf states and some of the eastern states. Exposure to natural gas prices is another big one. Natural gas prices are variable. That variability gets passed through to customers. To the extent that a state or utility is more exposed to natural gas as a source of fuel for its power generation, and maybe has pipeline constraints into its region, that can also be a pretty significant regional driver of changes in electricity prices.
Allison, I'd love you to hear your thoughts. Ryan said PGM, so now we get to talk about it, right?
Thanks,
I didn't
Ryan.
raise it. The story makes a lot of sense. Higher prices induce new supply, and the market finds a new equilibrium. It seems that in something about our electricity sector right now that's not working. Now, that could be political cycles are faster than investment cycles. It could be that something gets in the way of that price mediation mechanism. What are your thoughts on those questions?
Oh gosh, how much time do we have?
I can allot as much time to this question as possible because I think that's actually really important.
It is
right?
really
like
important.
PJM, for those who don't know, we're all learning this together, right? It occupies a significant portion of the Mid-Atlantic. Prices there, and there's these kind of confusing instruments called capacity markets, which are supposed to create a market pricing mechanism for excess generation capacity when it's going to be needed, are like reaching their targeted limits. They're price capped. There is like apparently from the outside a real challenge in that market for meeting the needs of the day. And I think it's fair to say that is both like an economic security and a national security issue, because There's an immense amount of data center development that occurs in the PJM region. Our own research coming out in a few weeks shows that actually the defense industrial base, there's a significant portion of that located in the PJM region. So we need these structures to work. So I'm happy to spend as much time as necessary to get a good understanding of what you think is actually just the market working as designed and where potential reforms might be necessary.
Sure, so let's go.
Yeah.
So you think about PJM, there's restructured competition. The generators come in when the markets signal on a 3-year forward basis that the prices are high enough to incent new entry.
Yeah.
That's effectively what happens in the combination of the energy and the capacity markets in the region. In a world where those markets were functioning as they should be, that's what would happen. There's a few things going on. One is the markets were designed around a largely centralized thermal fleet, 25 years ago, when the operating characteristics, of the resources were very similar and predictable. So now we have although PJM is behind relative to the diversity of its resource mix, we have a diversifying resource mix. We then have states who started procuring resources to meet policies, which is a state policy choice. In those cases, it wasn't the market that was signaling entry and exit, but instead these state policies.
Yes.
You then have an interconnection system within PJM, meaning how fast resources hook up to the grid, that has kind of gotten overwhelmed over the last decade and effectively stopped. They stopped the interconnection queue for a couple of years as they started to bring in reforms. That's on the upswing. There's still a lot of work to do. So even if the markets were sending the signal to say, hey, the price is high enough, come in, new power plant, and build, you can't get online for 5 to 7 years because you got to go through the interconnection queue process.
Right.
And so this market that would work if kind of it had evolved to continue to maintain its relevancy relative to today's realities, has some underlying challenges. And then, of course, there's the political aspects, and you see that there was a price cap on the capacity market that the governor of Pennsylvania agreed to at first with PJM. It was just announced a couple days ago that at least politically, the states and PJM have agreed to extend the price cap through the decade. I'm not sure how that works relative to some of the processes going on in PJM right now, where they're trying to figure out how to manage their increasing shortages. So the opportunity is tremendous. I think when you have competition, you do better. But when there are aspects of the overall system, which is not just the market, it includes the interconnection process, it includes the transmission system planning process, as well as how smart and dynamic operations are, you run into trouble. And that's where we are today in PJM.
Ryan, what are your thoughts on this question?
Well, I think the political challenge is everyone pays that price for capacity, whether you're a residential customer, a large industrial customer, or a data center. When the price goes up, the entire market pays that price for capacity. And a lot of the driver of this increase in the price of capacity is coming from data centers, large data centers. These are customers who I believe are willing to pay a premium for capacity and do not want to shift costs onto other customers. So the market is set up in a way that I think doesn't have the flexibility that could be there in terms of allowing the data centers to come in and pay for the impacts that they're having on the power system. Let's
talk about data centers for a moment. Incredible source of new demand. And actually a very important one, right? Our own research here at CSIS has looked at sort of the economic productivity gains that can be realized through AI in our economy. And it becomes obvious that we want to use electricity to power data centers, right? Compared to a lot of other uses. That's why there's this seemingly boundless willingness to pay from the hyperscalers and others to develop large data centers. But it seems that it's creating some real challenges in our system. There are now ideas floating around Washington that hyperscalers and data center developers are going to make a pledge that they will not develop in a way that increases retail rates. I want to start first on the technical front with Ryan. Do we even have the tools necessary to attribute even a very large data center or a fleet of data centers in a region, what they're doing to power prices versus everything else you've talked about, the fuel limitations, the generation mix, the pipeline infrastructure, the supply chain costs? Like, are we in a position where we can actually determine the price impacts of marginal load?
I think the short answer is approximately, but not precisely. There are ways with modeling, to model scenarios with and without new load and sort of roughly estimate what their impact on prices and costs have been. Any economist can come up with a number, but I would say that any number that you hear from an economist is probably going to be right in terms of order of magnitude, but it's a very hard question to answer precisely.
Allison, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think politically it's even harder to answer. So
Yeah.
I also haven't met a data center developer or end use customer who wants to do anything other than pay their fair share.
Right.
But there's a real complexity underneath that statement that no one party is actually necessarily in control of all the information relative to make that determination. So there's the obvious price in PJM. 40% of the last capacity auction that cleared, that demand can be identified as needed to power data centers, right? But then you think about the network upgrades. Okay, which network, which piece of the interconnection equipment, which substation transformer should the customer pay for? Even that's pretty straightforward. But then you get to PJM's transmission system planning. And the utilities in PJM, sorry to jump back to PJM, it varies in flavor around the country, but the utilities in PJM can build their own local transmission lines, charge them to all of their customers, and the only reason it's getting built is to support the data center.
Right.
And it may be, from a time perspective or a regulatory perspective, difficult or impossible to allow the end-use customer to fully embrace that cost. And so there's a lot of nuance. That's just one example that just makes the question not clear and makes it really easy to put some with some merit and with some unfortunate kind of lack of understanding, making data centers the easy target relevant to.
Maybe we could spend a minute on where we are today. Ryan, you guys have just published this report. Where around the country in your findings are data centers significantly impacting electricity rates?
Well, I think what's interesting is the analysis that we did for this study looked back over the last 5 or 10 years and tried to understand drivers of price changes over that period. What we found was actually the states that were experiencing load growth over that historical period tended to experience lower rates or rate declines in inflation-adjusted terms relative to the other states.
Wait.
This Yeah, what we found when we looked at the historical data is there states historically that had the spare capacity to accommodate new large customers could bring those customers into the system and spread the fixed cost of their grid across more customers, and that resulted in lower rates for everyone. So basically, you have more customers sharing in the fixed cost of the system, and that can bring rates down. And
in that context, in an ideal world, it seems like a data center is the thing you want to add, right? These are gigawatt scale black holes of electricity demand, and so they would sort of in a world where you're paying for the numerator with the activity in the denominator, you want the denominator to go up. You want consumption to go up, right? So what is causing so much concern?
Yeah, if you have spare capacity, that situation that you just described, Joseph, works out perfectly.
Got it.
The challenge that we're now seeing going forward is we have quickly run out of that spare capacity. And so now, if you want to bring a new data center into the power grid, you're more likely than not going to need to invest in new infrastructure to accommodate that demand growth, and that's where this situation becomes more complex.
So, I'll put you on the spot, but if you look forward, when do you, as an analyst, start to get concerned about running out of capacity in particular regions in a way that data centers will start causing price impacts? Maybe we're already seeing it in PJM, as Allison says.
I was going to say now. Yeah, it partly depends on where you are, but it's increasingly the case that data centers are looking for any spare capacity where they can find it. So we are definitely at the point where this is an issue. The good news is I do think there are some solutions to this issue that go beyond just making investments in traditional grid infrastructure and increasing rates as a result.
And I want to be a little bit careful before we make data centers the hero of the story, right? They are big infrastructure projects. They have impacts. They have impacts on local, air, local water, local land use. And you heard recently Microsoft come out with a set of announcements about how it's going to try and be a good citizen of the grid. I think every end use customer should be doing that, and I think they, in various degrees, are already working hard on that front. But they are causing stress to the system in new ways. Now they have the potential to be the heroes of the story, right? The saviors of the grid, with a little bit of flexibility, a little bit of increased compute relative to how the grid operates with them on it.
Yeah.
You have a real opportunity to make these data centers grid assets in a way that could really transform, the way that the U.S. grid runs today, and that part is exciting.
Ryan, were you thinking along the same lines in terms of data centers as grid assets?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I think there are two ways that this can work in the interest of all consumers. One is the situation that Allison just described, where you have a data center coming online with some flexibility. That could be flexibility in how it consumes energy, or that flexibility could also come from generation that's located on site and reduces their impact on the grid during constrained times of the day. That helps to alleviate or reduce the need to make investments in new infrastructure and can lead to these positive outcomes. The other case is, that flexibility doesn't necessarily have to come from the data center. Data centers could come in and pay other customers to be flexible and relieve some of that congestion on the power grid, and that can give you a similar outcome as well.
So that rings alarms for me of sort of like carbon offsetting credits, right? That for a long time, we've seen hyperscalers want to be carbon neutral, right, to satisfy climate commitments that the companies have made. But then you sort of get these contorted market structures of, purchasing renewable power in one place, but needing to run all the time. So you sort of get these like virtual markets that don't mean much. Do we need to be aware of that potential risk? Is that potentially a problem for retail ratepayers? Or is that something we can, in your view, Allison, we can design fairly well?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to that question. One is how are we dealing with the emissions related to on-site generation?
Right.
So you saw during Winter Storm Fern, an order comes out of the White House, says, okay, in PJM you can run your backup diesel gen sets without violating any air pollution requirements. That seems pretty unsystematic relevant to predicting how things work, and there could be offset engagements there. You have opportunities to have carbon sequestration with your on-site gen. That's one bucket of issues that I think has to be dealt with and is lagging behind where the markets are.
Yep.
But my thinking on how data centers can be real grid assets, and to Ryan's example of adjacent capacity, that's just capacity, right? That's peak shaving. That's super exciting. So you can say, wow, this set of, this virtual power plant, which I used to just call aggregations of distributed energy resources, could come together and they could, take from the grid or give to the grid in a way that shaves peak and brings down top capacity needs, which then drives total investment, right? As you know, we run the grid at like 50% or less efficiency most of the time. It's built out for like the 8th day of Winter Storm Fern, which is the most extreme day of power demand during the year. And there's a lot of opportunity within that. So I think the winners are going to be those who figure out how to take advantage of the opportunity for creative, innovative capacity solutions, like getting partners and organizations to bring down other use if the data center itself can't.
So let's return to that pledge for just a moment. I don't want to dwell on it, but I just think it's really interesting. You can imagine a world where we sort of create a set of standards. I don't know how formal they will be, but it could be data centers building on-site generation. It could be battery systems to be flexible to peak. It could be flexible demand at data centers. It could be participating in markets where they're paying others to be part of demand. You can put together a reasonable case that this allows us to build data centers, largest source of growth in the electricity sector for the coming years, and not like analytically you're not going to impact rates. But everything else I've heard from Ryan tells me that rates could still go up and could still go up faster than inflation in other places. So does that create, how do we prove that model? How should they prove that model? And how does the USG play an active role in doing that?
The USG?
Yeah, the US government, whether it's the regulators or the Department of Energy or anybody involved. And then we'll talk about the solutions that they can bring to bear as well.
Yeah. I have solutions in mind, so Ryan, you want to go?
I guess, maybe my short answer is, you can only control what you can control, right?
Right.
Like I said earlier, I do think that the rising cost of transmission and distribution equipment, that is a reality. It's just a reality we're stuck with to an extent. But the impact of load growth on the grid is something that we can control to a
Right.
degree.
Yeah.
And some work, some analysis, some research that we have coming out later this month will show that bringing that load on with more flexibility using the models that we just described won't just negate any potential increase in rates that results from that, but it can actually put downward pressure on rates. Whether that will actually lead to rates going down or just not growing as quickly as they otherwise would is still an open question. But this is a meaningful, impactful tool that we have at our disposal. And so definitely think that developing programs, initiatives, policies around this is an opportunity for us to address the affordability challenge.
Allison, let's hear some solutions. What's the most, we've got politicians who are very worried about this challenge. We've got a private sector that is acutely aware of it. What should we do?
Yeah, I just co-chaired Governor Mikey Sherrill's energy transition effort, and so I thought very deeply about these issues for the last 2 months. And one thing we can't control is the load forecast, right? We all know we're wrong. We have these staggering load forecasts in front of us. And so to me, I think about the solution set in the near term. What do we do right now? And then what do we do long term? But we need to do stuff right now while that load forecast, the reality of what's going to happen in the markets plays out.
Yep.
We could have a GPU efficiency breakthrough tomorrow that changes this entire conversation. People are talking about solar from base in a way that isn't just in the comics anymore. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
So what do you do in the near term? You figure out ways to bring costs down quickly. Or at least arrest the stop of costs going up quickly. The first way to do that is to make better use of your existing system, right? As I said, I've been kind of on this, I'm like a one-trick pony on increasing the efficiency of the existing grid, right? You can do that by using AI-enabled automation efforts. You can do that by using AI-enabled modeling so that you can look all the way from generator interconnection to transmission system planning through to operations and to run the system more dynamically. Then what do? You once you're done with the computer stuff, you use advanced transmission technologies. You do reconductoring. You use advanced power flow controls. You use dynamic line ratings to, again, increase the efficiency of the system. And then the third thing is, I think, what Ryan and I were just talking about, which is using opportunities to deploy storage, to deploy virtual power plants and other resources that have kind of 6 to 12 month deployment timeframes instead of 3 to 5 to 7 year timeframes when you think about big thermal deployments or even big renewables deployments. So those are the things you can do right now. They won't bring cost breaks next month. And that's a reality that we all need to accept. And I think there's going to be 36 governors races this year where we have to be careful. But there is a way to arrest the increases very quickly while these longer term reforms like transmission system development, new generation development are able to play themselves out relative to demand.
So I hear, let's use some of these kind of efficiency models, demand flexibility, virtual power plants, new models for developing data centers immediately. And then I hear in the midterm, we need to find a lot of more better efficiencies in the transmission grid. And then what about generation? I mean, it seemed like you can kind of look at this simply and you're like, maybe is there something we should do to go back to just making it very easy to build power generation in the US?
Yeah, I'm sure Allison will have thoughts on this. I mean, the longer term need that we have is to find some way to accelerate the interconnection queue and get new utility scale generation online more quickly than it can today. Part of that is, again, delays associated with getting the equipment. That's a separate issue. But once you have a power plant that you're ready to bring online, there can still be a multi-year wait associated with getting the transmission studies conducted that actually give you permission to connect to the transmission grid.
That to me feels like as an observer, it's one of the most confusing things to me in this entire endeavor, that there's terawatts of generation that has been proposed at various stages of planning, just sort of awaiting permission to interconnect.
Yep.
Is that the sort of magical solution to our problems? If you look at this as a 10-year super cycle, not just the next 2 years.
Fixing interconnection has to be part of the solution. We took actions when I was a commissioner at FERC to start the process of improving But really, again, it's a place where technology can come in and help us. If you think about the way that our grid modeling and grid operation systems and the way that studies get done to allow for new interconnections, it's like, when I was a kid and you got Lego, you just got like Lego. And you had to, and sometimes it turned out well and sometimes it didn't. If we were building this from whole cloth today, you'd get like the new sets that come, they're going to be perfect when they're built, right? Because they're built with today's knowledge, today's advantage. Our computer systems and modeling systems are not there. And there's been a real resistance, as much a cultural inertia that comes through in regulatory proceedings to embrace new technologies, to embrace consistent technologies, to embrace sharing and transparency around data, so that you can allow some of this innovation to take place. All of that has to contribute to speeding up the interconnection process.
And who's responsible for being the forcing agent in that conversation, right? Is it regulators at FERC? Is it Congress saying this has to be done? Is it the executive branch saying we're going to do it, come hell or high water?
And the state regulators, any or all of the above, right? I would love for Congress to tell FERC, to tell all of the grid planning regions to use a consistent set of standards and provide metrics relative to technology that can advance planning, advance interconnection queues, to require them to do things like PJM is doing now with Tapestry, which is a Google moonshot or an Alphabet moonshot, to automate portions of the interconnection process while the more complex stuff gets done. So I think the state regulators can do the same thing. The utilities have a really important role to play here. But if any state legislature or Congress wants to tell the regulators to do it, that would be great.
Ryan, your thoughts on kind of high leverage points here?
Yeah, no, I think one important thing here is, we've been talking about utilities a little bit about, we kind of been characterizing them as this passive entity that costs flow through to the consumer in the form of rates, but they are very much like an active participant that's in the middle of all of this. And a lot of the solutions that we've been describing are not capital intensive solutions. And that is a problem from a regulatory standpoint, because utilities make money by going out and investing capital. That's how they earn a return on those investments. And if we're now asking them to go out and do something that isn't in the interest of their shareholders, it creates a challenge. So I think one thing that we need to do to really unlock a lot of this value is some innovation around regulation and utility business models to align their financial interest with this big opportunity that we have.
I mean, this seems like a problem we can solve either with regulation or subsidy. Allison, which do you think is most critical?
Regulation or subsidy?
Yeah, I mean, you can either compel them to do it or you can pay them to do it.
Sure. I mean, I think there's been a decade of conversation around the utility business model. And if there was ever a moment where the opportunity to actually align utility incentives with some of this less capital intensive improvements existed, today's the day. And I think as we see, even 12 months ago, I would have said, people are not going to go off grid. The data centers are not going to go off grid because it's less reliable power, it's inefficient, it's too expensive, and it takes too long. But now you see 40 plus gigawatts of off grid, at least for some extended period of time as bridging or permanent off grid generation. That's a threat to utilities. If I was a utility today, I would be running to my regulator and saying, please, let's talk about the business model, utility, performance-based rate making. Let's figure out how to do it so that we can do all these things, make more room on our system today, and keep all of these data centers on the grid and maintain that role as the central player that Ryan describes them as.
Yeah, and I think, Allison, when you combine just the sheer magnitude of this opportunity to what it was, over the past decade, that has brought importance to the need for regulatory innovation. The other important thing here, which is the whole point of our discussion, is affordability, right? And this becoming an election-defining issue. I think utilities and regulators both just understand now that they can't be leaving cost-effective options on the table. That's just not going to fly. And so it just draws more attention to the need for regulatory reform in that context as well.
The U.S. hasn't made major policy changes to the way we govern the power sector since 2005, but really arguably since the early 1990s. Are we going to find ourselves in that conversation again?
I didn't know we left that conversation.
Well, I mean, power people never left it.
Yes, that's right. It's very hard to translate the complexity of stakeholder processes for utility rate cases or regional grid operator transmission planning processes to any very smart person, right, who
Right.
doesn't think about this all day.
I'm like a child wandering in the darkness. Yeah.
Governance needs reform, period, and we also need to get things done.
Yeah.
We are at a moment, at a inflection point on the need to build new infrastructure and to figure out how to run our infrastructure, our system of infrastructure to support this economy in a more reliable, more affordable way.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of other ways to govern the power sector. A lot of the sources of rate increases I'm hearing, transmission, infrastructure, to some extent distribution infrastructure, I don't know on whom's balance sheet that needs to sit. In the other places, it sits with the government, right? I mean, we've seen so many changes in the way that the U.S. government interacts with markets over the last 12 months, the last 5 years. The power sector is the one place where we haven't seen enormous changes. And I guess my question is, should we be thinking really big about what this new era of load growth, which is not just a data center issue, it's everything else we already talked about, really means for how the U.S. maintains an affordable, resilient, and effective power sector?
Yeah, I mean, the regulatory framework is like this giant fog that is so hard to break through. And to my mind, when I'm thinking like speed, solutions, cost, I'm thinking, what can people outside of government do?
Right.
Bake it as much as they can, and then go through the regulatory requirements they have to. I mean, I think, yes, thinking big about one of the most heavily regulated industries in the world and the disconnect between the interested capital in the U.S. power markets and system and the ability of the existing infrastructure to integrate that capital, that's wild, right? You're totally right. So to me, how realistic is it, and should we wait for it versus can we get around it?
Right.
Yeah, no, and I think it's just, I hope we don't allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good, given the magnitude of the opportunity that we're looking at right now. If you look at the market cap of Google or Amazon or Meta, any of those companies individually has a market cap that is multiples larger than the market cap of all of the investor-owned utilities in the United States combined. So you think about the resources that they can bring to the industry to create new solutions to problems that we've been struggling with for decades. It's really mind-boggling, and there's going to need to be a little bit of acceptance of, let's get it as right as we can and move forward to pursue some of these opportunities and refine it as we go, rather than getting tied up in 4 or 5 years of regulatory review that ultimately sort of let the opportunity pass us by before we act.
Right. You both have been very generous with your time. This has been a rich discussion. Thank you. I do want to close. We'll start with Ryan, then we'll go to Allison. One thing you're watching over the next 3 to 6 months that you think the viewers might be underrating?
It's a nuanced topic, but I'm keeping a close eye on how utilities continue to develop the rates that they're charging to the data center customers, and seeing what new innovations are introduced there that sort of allow the full costs that are being introduced by these customers to be recovered from the large loads and insulating other customers in the process.
And Allison, what's on your radar for the next 3 months?
I'm really excited by the opportunity that we are seeing in New Jersey and Virginia. And I think affordability is a nonpartisan thing. Sure. And so all of a sudden there's this opportunity for policies that have been, batted around by people like Ryan and I in hotel room corners at conferences that nobody goes to for years and years, right, that can actually help to bring down prices. And we're seeing the efforts in New Jersey through the new governor there, as well as the efforts in Virginia, where they're talking about opportunities for energy bills emerge. That could be it could be a playbook for these, as I mentioned, 36 states that are going to have elections coming up this fall. So looking forward to seeing some progress there. Great. Well, I look forward to following this issue with both of you. Thank you so much. Ryan, we're going to link your report and any forthcoming stuff in the comment box on YouTube. Allison, you're always a welcome contributor here at CSIS. Thank you both for joining us. Thanks, Joseph. Thank you. Colleagues, thank you so much for being part of the conversation today. Do stay tuned for further CSIS discussions on this and other matters. This is Joseph Mikett signing off.